Hello, everyone. This is Jake Varn with the National Governors Association. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this webinar on how extreme weather trends impact the transportation networks. This is one of our quarterly webinars for our Transportation Learning Network series. And for those that are coming from outside the National Governors Association, NGA represents all 55 states and territories. And within our Center of Best Practices, our Environment, Infrastructure, and Energy Division, we support sharing the best practices for transportation advisors for the nation's governors. I'm very pleased to be hosting this webinar for all of you and talking about this really important issue. We are joined today by Deb Matherly from WSP and Pat Bai, who are working on a paper for TRB on this topic. And we're also joined by Ed Sniffen, the Deputy Director for Hawaii's DOT. Just for some housekeeping items, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Zoom platform, we will be able to take questions throughout the presentation, throughout the webinar today. There's a Q&A feature that you should see where you should be able to click and type in any questions. If you have any issues or if you wanted to just email me a question, you can always contact me at jvarn, that's V as in Victor, ARN, at nga.org. That being said, I'd like now to turn it over to Deb and Pat, and when you guys are ready, just feel free to say next slide, and I'll move on to each new page. So Deb, turning it over to you.
Okay, thanks. Welcome to everyone who's here. Again, my name is Deb Matherly. I've been a transportation planner for 40 years now, and I've been working in emergency transportation and merging into resilience over about the last 2 decades. My colleague, Patricia Bai, we've been working in similar fields for about the same amount of time, and we've been joined together on a couple of projects here to really work with transportation departments on emergency planning and resilience. So next slide. Okay. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, there are many different definitions of resilience. The one is from the National Research Council, ability to plan, prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, or adapt to adverse events, and also from 100 Resilient Cities. But resilience has also been defined as robustness, redundancy, reliability. Some say bouncing back stronger than before. Some key aspects are being prepared, forward-looking, future-ready, aware, nimble. It's about being ready. So, next slide. Okay. According to the National Oceanic and Aeronautic Administration, NOAA, 2019 is the 5th consecutive year, from 2015 through 2019, in which 10 or more billion-dollar weather and climate disaster events have impacted the United States. You can see many major events of many different kinds are occurring constantly around the country. In 2019, we had our great share of wildfires, tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, hail, a little of everything. Next slide. So the number of billion-dollar events has been increasing over the past 40 years, as you can see by the bars. The bars represent the number of events, and the lines represent the dollar amounts. And over the last 40 years, the years with 10 or more separate billion-dollar disaster events include 1998, then 2008, then 2011 and 2012, and now 2015 to 2019. So again, the colors represent the types of events. The black line down here represents the 5-year average cost. So this is something that is not going away. Next slide. So departments of transportation have been paying attention to events and working to get ahead of the curve for a long time now. Coordinated efforts have been underway for many years, from a major security emphasis before and after the 9/11-2001 attacks, through a more all hazards and multimodal approach to emergency preparedness following Hurricane Katrina, and with a more explicit proactive resilience emphasis to build back better following Hurricane Sandy. Particularly since Sandy, the transportation sector has strengthened partnerships with FEMA, HUD, EPA, and other organizations to rebuild stronger communities, with resilient transportation as a foundation and as a key partner. So the transportation modes and sectors have been working closely together to foster resilience, as shown by a few examples here. AASHTO leadership has the Committee on Transportation System Security and Resilience that Ed Sniffen leads, and he'll be discussing that shortly. The National Cooperative Highway Research Program, NCHRP, of the Transportation Research Board coordinates closely with AASHTO and FHWA. FHWA has been funding pilot projects and developing guidance and webinars, as you can see. And there are also comparable efforts in transit and air travel and others. So have been working together for a long time. Next slide. Okay. One of the key findings from the 2017 AASHTO peer exchange is that agency leadership is critical for institutionalizing resiliency into an organization's culture. I led a team to develop a primer for CEOs and senior leadership on transportation resilience. We spoke with DOT CEOs and senior staff across the country. Last July, Carlos Braceras, then president of AASHTO and still the Utah Department of Transportation Executive Director, testified before the Senate Infrastructure Committee on Transportation Priorities. One of his key points was the importance of investing in resilience for our shared infrastructure. He held up and referred to the CEO primer that we had handed him just 2 days before as he was making his point on the importance of resilience. And he has been supportive of resilience and of this project throughout. Next slide. When we spoke with departments of transportation, we found out what was important to them, why resilience mattered to them, and what they were doing about it. And this depended on whether you called it resilience or not. As one of my favorite quotes is, whatever you call it, customers expect this work to be done. They expect us to keep things working. Resilience truly crosses political and ideological boundaries. It just makes sense to be prepared. So the quotes throughout this presentation are from our conversations with DOTs. As one CEO told us, it's hard to make resilience a high priority until you experience a serious event. So more and more states are having kind of no more moments saying they need to focus on resilience, and this constant battle of recovery is really hard to take. Okay, next slide. So another of the key findings from the AASHTO peer exchange is that framing resilience in terms of risk, economic impacts, and return on investment can garner support. As we all know, transportation is central to the economy and social fabric of communities, regions, and states in normal times and in emergencies. Now, we all depend on complex networks and movements of people, supplies, communications, power, and more. And the most vulnerable among us are particularly vulnerable in emergencies. So transportation is essential to everyone, but often transportation facilities are co-located with communications, power, and water and sewer facilities. So our interactions increase productivity, but our interdependencies can leave us vulnerable to the weakest links in the chain. And as a simple example, if a road segment washes out, it could sever water communications and power lines. And the power and communications lines can then disrupt traffic signals and streetlights as well as services. So so finding partners and working together to find common causes and identify and strengthen weak links and build resilience benefits everyone. This picture here represents a very simple partnership example. Fish and Wildlife and Tourism agencies in Maine and Minnesota, at least probably in others as well, have invested funds to improve culverts and bridges to improve fish passages, with a side benefit of decreasing operating costs and virtually eliminating culvert blowouts. So, in other words, working together is a good thing. Okay, next slide. So it's important to be intelligent about risk. You can't buy your way out of all risk. You can invest wisely in operations, procurement practices, and engineering to prioritize and substantially reduce the effects of various hazards and risks. Designers and engineers rely on manuals, AASHTO, and federal guidance, and other established procedures. So AASHTO, FHWA, and NCHRP have been working to incorporate resilient design practices into all these different resources. So, next slide. Many agencies are somewhat siloed, and if you see on the picture on the side, resilience is very cross-cutting, kind of like safety and asset management, and in some agencies, sustainability. So resilience can help bind everyone together and help different departments find a common cause and realize how they can fit better together. Getting staff on board through cross-training and collaboration and looking at their jobs and practices through basically a resilience lens can help them. So now we'll turn this over to Pat to walk through some examples of how DOTs are really baking in resilience.
Okay. Thanks,
Next
Deb.
slide.
Yes, we could have the next slide. Perfect. So I'm going to start with operations and maintenance, that we should really treasure operations and maintenance. You know, the operations and maintenance folks, they're the boots on the ground. They know where the regular vulnerabilities are. They know their maintenance needs, from clearing culverts before a storm to using crack sealing to prolong pavement life. Many DOTs even cross-train their operations and maintenance staff to support emergency operations, as well as traffic incident management. They're also critical members of design teams in many departments, providing the crucial long-term maintenance perspective in the early stages and throughout project development. Some state examples include Oregon, where they use data from maintenance to identify and map vulnerable areas and then monitor those vulnerable areas more closely over time. In Alabama, they purchased a more versatile equipment that has multiple uses. For example, that they can be used as snow plows when necessary. The next slide, please. For emergency operations and response, training, exercising, and learning is just one mantra of emergency management. South Carolina Department of Transportation does a full-scale practice of laying out supplies on evacuation routes prior to every hurricane season. You don't need to have a season or a regular recurring event. You can use planned special events such as sporting events or whatever typically happens in your community to practice collaboration and traffic management with public safety. You can also probe these crisis incidents for efficiencies to apply every day, such as expedited procurement strategies. Making sure you have contracts in place before an emergency saves you time and money. We also can employ everyday practices for emergencies. Maintenance management systems enable DOTs to record damages, issue work orders, and capture costs for later federal emergency reimbursement funds from the FHWA and from FEMA. We can also build resistance into recovery plans. For example, do short-term recovery actions facilitate build back better strategies? Do you consider whether or not to build back? Some states have created multi-agency resilience groups to coordinate and collaborate. For example, Washington State has established a multi-agency resilience cabinet that holds regular meetings and tabletop exercises across the state. Colorado set up a flood recovery office to coordinate and oversee recovery and resilience efforts after the 2013 floods. Next slide, please. In terms of design and engineering, states have incorporated vulnerability into their designs, ranging from signage and signals. For example, Florida DOT signs and signals are designed with mast arms along the coastal areas instead of strain poles to be more resilient and withstand hurricane wind loads. They've also addressed drainage, culverts, roadways, and bridges. The Florida DOT drainage system design is being adjusted along the coastline to allow for more efficient water flow out of flooded areas. The Florida DOT is also strengthening areas with seawalls and elevating roads where possible to mitigate flooding, and is continuing to identify other resilience strategies. In Maine, they've increased the design standards for their culverts and bridge replacements after Hurricane Sandy. It's important to recognize potential co-benefits that occur when you're looking at these changes to your design and engineering. For example, some of those changes can decrease your operating or your maintenance cost. Others might enable you to find improvements in other performance measures. Next slide, please. This slide I want to talk about technology and materials, something that's considered in everything, but it's not always looked at through a resilience lens. You can explore, states have explored innovative techniques and materials. For example, the Virginia DOT builds corrosion-free bridges with new materials. The Utah DOT uses drones for bridge inspections and topographic surveys and landslide assessments, getting better information at a lower cost. You can also use materials that better address current and future conditions, such as the pavement materials or coatings that can decrease temperatures and/or extend the useful life. For example, the city of Los Angeles uses reflective paint on its streets that has been found to reduce temperatures 10 to 15 degrees on average. You can also look at, states have been using automated monitoring systems to improve responses and public safety. Next slide, please. In North Carolina, the DOT has a real-time website system that monitors road closures and a flood inundation mapping and alert network, which is shown on this slide, that identifies flooding, but also it enables them to view the water, to know when the water elevation is low enough to do bridge repairs. The Vermont DOT has created a resilience planning tool that's a web-based application that identifies vulnerable bridges, culverts, and road embankments It offers a risk assessment based on vulnerability and criticality, and then also provides potential mitigation measures. This planning tool was designed to be used not by the engineers and the Vermont DOT personnel, but by the state town councils, the planning commissions, and the local emergency management agencies. It was designed for even the volunteers on those entities as opposed to the technical folks. Next slide, please. So I've just went through some specific examples of how state transportation agencies are being resilient. You know, to step back a little bit, what can we learn from these examples? So how can you be more resilient? Well, you can consider the long-term life cycle. You can embrace innovation. You use risk awareness and criticality to prioritize what's being done. You can encourage collaboration across the regions, across divisions, across functions. And there's one more that's not on this slide. That's persistence. As one of our interviewees told us, keep throwing seeds, even if they fall on hard ground. Next slide, please. One last thing I want to talk about before I turn this back over to Deb is the critical role of leadership. Governors, agency heads, senior managements, the role that they play in resilience. As one of the leaders told us, resilience needs flexibility in both policy and practice. Senior leaderships who are the only ones that can address both policy and the practices involved, and that can provide that flexibility necessary to address both. They are also the only ones that are looking at and are responsible for the full scope. And just as importantly, without the commitment and buy-in of the governors, the agency heads, and senior management, without it being one of their priorities, it's not going to happen. So given this critical role, what can leaders do? Well, they can promote the importance of resilience. Resilience can be part of your mission. You can be prepared to explain why resilience makes a difference to the state. And you can work to convince the legislature, the business community, other stakeholders to support resilience efforts, even when the impacts are not immediate and those efforts could be costly. You can celebrate resilience efforts that are underway. You can be supportive of the staff time spent on resilience and welcome adaptive thinking and actions. Along with promoting the importance, it's important to be actively engaged in that resilience work, to be intentional, deliberate, and systematic about keeping a resilience focus in both long-range practices and planning and in the daily efforts. You can actively solicit and incorporate ideas offered about resilience. And you can support cross-functional collaboration and encourage innovation and adaptive approaches. Another key element is to seek partners in state and local governments, in public, private, and nonprofit sector organizations. The benefits accrue to the entire state and the region. Many people will be supportive and share in the results of resilience efforts. And last but not least, it's important to recognize that even small changes have big results over time. Resilience pays off in the long run. Next slide, please. So to help leaders in their critical role, here are some key questions to be asked. Do you know what's out there? What are the most likely things that could happen in your state, in your region, and what is going to be impacted if something does happen? Are you planning proactively? It's especially be alert and forward-looking to any new threats and realities. Do you understand the potential alternatives? This can help you better balance the risks and costs and be prepared with build back strategies when necessary. Is resilience part of your performance measures? Is it part of your funding criteria? Do you have resilience measures in your strategic and capital planning? Is it part of your operational measures being tracked? I mean, as we all know, if something isn't being measured, it probably isn't happening. And with that, I'd like to turn this back over to Deb.
Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So, thanks. And in summary, departments of transportation have a lot to offer and a lot to gain from resilience. And to sum up, DOTs are really on the road to resilience, and they are becoming increasingly collaborative, proactive, and smart. And so with that, let's turn it over to, let's ask some questions, okay?
Great, thank you. Yep,
Thank you.
Thank you, Deb and Pat. We've already gotten a few questions in during your presentation, and for others that are tuned in, please feel free to keep sending those in through the Q&A function. But I just want to start with saying, thank you, Deb and Pat, for that great presentation, and really highlighting the important role that governors have to play, especially in that, fostering interagency collaboration. I think, as we've seen both at state and federal levels, the most effective interagency collaborations take the buy-in of not only the leadership of those agencies, but also the impetus and buy-in from their bosses, really driving that work forward. So thank you both for touching on that. One question that we have from Rachel Chambers: do you have any resources for messaging regarding the cost of inaction, meaning the idea that not investing in resilience will actually be more detrimental to long-term budget priorities?
That's a tough one. There are resources being developed. I know that there's NCHRP is expecting to do a new project on communicating the business case for resilience. I have to say there are, I believe, Federal Highways has some resources on this and the National Institute of Building Standards, I think in 2017, in one of its reports, identified that there's they found a 6-to-1 payback from mitigation projects, and they have a 4-to-1 payback on resilience in general. So the transportation specific case is still being built. There are places like Colorado DOT where they've shown that they built something back better, and they had a similar storm and it didn't collapse like the previous one. But it's still being developed. But there are some resources, but I don't have any that I can pinpoint except for the National Institute of Business Standards right now. But we do have some sources identified in our CEO primer. Pat, did you have any specific suggestions on that?
One thing I want to say is that, one of the costs of inaction is really the costs on the community and the services that are not, that are disrupted because of that event. And I think there's more recognition of that recovery time is there. And then there's also, sort of the reality of one of the cost of inaction is really on the careers of the people involved. And that has to do with that impact on the community.
And this is Jake. I would just add, thank you for the question, Rachel. I think as both Deb and Pat said, the cost of inaction, the actual dollar amount that's being attached after a disaster happens is still a developing science. It's the actual impact on people's lives when they have to leave their homes, when they have to commute farther for their jobs, the change in an education plan for a student. All of those are ripple trickle down effects that aren't necessarily captured in the immediate NOAA and FEMA calculations of a storm. So I think as more studying this issue, I expect that issue, the cost of inaction, will continue to rise. I have another question in here from someone that says, our agency builds to FEMA flood standards, but science has shown that those underestimate the sea level rise our state should prepare for. Are any state DOTs building to higher standards beyond the FEMA flood standards?
I'd say the answer is yes. And I know one agency in particular, the Port Authority of New York PATH, is developing its design standards based on design flood projections. And I believe Maine DOT has increased its standards to a higher flood year level, because again, they're getting a payback in terms of not having to replace things. But I think one element of this is that the design standards, if you're looking for a 500-year flood, you need to be thinking of what is a 500-year flood event in these projections of higher precipitation, higher flood levels, higher storm surges, etc. So the retroactive, the backwards looking standards probably are not sufficient for future forecasts. So I think a lot of DOTs and agencies are looking at sea level rise and climate change, as well as increased precipitation, increased drought levels, increased heat levels. When you're building highways, if heat is going to be higher, or if you're going to have more freeze and thaw cycles, you need to be taking those into effect in your design.
Great. Anything to add to that, Pat?
No, I think Deb covered that really well. Another state that we talked about how Florida is working on that. That's another state that has kind of recognized that need, and one to watch in terms of an answer to that question.
And I think California, Oregon, and Washington are others that are leaders in that area as well.
Great, thank you. One other question from Rachel. She noted that New York City made headlines last fall for their intentional flood testing of the metro subway lines. I believe it's when they actually flooded the systems to test for faults. Do you see other statewide efforts to ensure public transit lines are adapted for climate risks?
Places like New Jersey, SEPTA, LA Metro, Atlanta, HART in the Hillsborough area rapid transit in Florida. There's a lot of places that have been doing this. There's a publication out, the Transit Cooperative Research Program report document 70. Improving the Resilience of Transit Systems Threatened by Natural Disasters. That was published in 2017. It's online, and there's 17 case studies of different transit agencies around the country, small and large, that are doing different things to become more resilient. Everything from small operational changes to major investments.
And I just want to add that in the past year or so, the Federal Transit Agency has put a focus on transit agencies addressing the issue of flooding on their facilities.
Great. Thank you both, Deb and Pat. I'd like to turn it now over to Ed Sniffen from Hawaii DOT to give a little bit of an update both from his state as well as his new role from our good friends at AASHTO. Ed, I'll pass it over to you. And again, just say next slide when you're ready.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Aloha, everyone. Good morning to some and good afternoon to most. Ed Sniffen with Hawaii DOT. I really appreciate being on this topic. It's a big one for a lot of our member states that are moving forward on resiliency. AASHTO, if anyone doesn't know, is an organization that's made up of the 50 member states and 2 territories to ensure that we can all speak with one transportation voice. As everybody knows, our 50 states, we differ quite a bit on policies, on politics, on procedures, and on priorities. But AASHTO does a tremendous job of making sure that we're all coordinated and making sure that we take care of our #1 responsibility in serving our communities better. So this organization really allows us all to speak with that unified voice in transportation. Next slide, please. AASHTO was set up a while ago, and in 2016, we looked at a restructuring to make sure that we can be a lot more efficient in the way we move forward. There's going to be several animations here, so you can just kind of go through them all. That we're going to start circling out things. We made this adjustment in our organization to ensure that we can respond to the needs of the member states and our constituents a lot faster. So we bunched a lot of committees together. We streamlined the processes by which we can get things done. And we created these enterprise cross-discipline committees that we expect to cut across all organizations. This transportation system and security and resiliency piece was a big one. We put together 2 committees that in the past, a committee on resilience and a committee on emergency management. I put them together because they live together. They automatically operate very well together to make sure that we can respond to the state's needs. Next slide, please. This committee's been very active in the past 3 years, making sure that we got everyone involved in the discussions on how we can become more resilient while we take care of emergency management now. In 2017, we had a resilience peer exchange that we put together with the Center for Environmental Excellence and FHWA. So we hosted about 36 states that got together to talk about resiliency, what it meant to them, and what it meant to move forward on. Since then, we've had 2 more. One was in 2018 in RISE in Colorado. And in 2019, we had TR 2019 in DC. Next slide, please. In all of these, we kind of distilled down the messages that we got from the states, from the stakeholders, from the attendees, to ensure that we understood what everybody was looking for. And some of the key findings that came out were these 3 that's listed up. And this kind of mirrors the presentation that you just heard before this one. #1 thing that came out, leadership buy-in is tremendous. I would say that anytime there's an emergency situation, it's very easy for all of us to be unified, to be coordinated in our approach. We have that emergency event in front of us. Any action we take, we can see feedback on how that action affects the event right away. This resiliency initiative is tremendously different. Although we can see the stressors on the system becoming more extreme more often right now, the goal that we're building towards is years down the line. In comparison to those issues that we're dealing with today, with congestion, with economic development, making sure people can get to their jobs and back home timely to make sure they can spend more time with their families, this initiative is a long lead and a long ways out. because that goal is not right in front of us, because we cannot see what our actions are doing to the situation immediately, it's a lot more difficult for our staff, for policymakers, for the general public to remain focused on this. So the agency lead is tremendous on this, making sure that we keep this top of mind, making sure that we align our direction in everything we do to ensure we hit our goals in the future. We also heard that it was very difficult to get the importance of this initiative out to the public without tying it to somebody's wallet. We all know as policymakers and as public officials that nothing that we say in our rhetoric makes any difference until we see it reflected in our budgets. So we pay attention to the economics. Now, as a citizen, it's the same thing. When I see something that's going to affect my paycheck, my pocketbook, I'm going to pay attention. So making sure that we tie these discussions to how these initiatives, the resiliency inputs and improvements will affect us in our state in the future really makes sense to ensure that we can get we can bring in all the support for the initiatives that we need. And the last big thing that was talked about was ensuring that we had this message and this initiative pushed out nationally for all to adopt. We all know in running our engineering organizations that standards, that manuals, that procedures guide a lot of what we do. We also know that some of the frustrations that we've had from the past was moving an organization as big as ours in new directions is difficult because we hear from staff or from communities, well, this is the way it's always been done. We're trying to make sure that we can incorporate or take advantage of these types of situations to ensure that we can incorporate these ideas, these methodologies, baking resilience into our operations by incorporating these new practices into our established manuals, our established procedures, things that our staff and our communities depend on. Once we see them in procedures, once we see them in manuals, then we really have a staying power for this initiative. And hopefully, by the time we're done with this incorporation, most of our staff and our communities will see that this is the way it's always been done. So resiliency will be baked into everything we do. Next slide, please. This is a graphic that the former chair of the CTSSR put together with WSP's support. So appreciate that, Mike Flood. It was put together because we wanted to make sure that we could say a lot of things with very little, very little words. Wanted to make sure there's a visual reminder of what we wanted to try and get to. What this represents is Mike Lewis's cycle of life. On the outside, you'll see the cradle to cradle approach, the planning, design, build, operate, maintain, and that continuous circle that we go through on our system. Now, in a perfect world, we would just live on that outer circle, making sure it's dependable, it's consistent, it's controllable. Making sure that process continues throughout is very easy until there's a stressor on the system. These emergency events that occur, these hurricanes, typhoons, flooding, earthquakes, all the events that require us to break out of that cycle on the outside and jump to an operational or emergency management operation, those are the ones that push us to the inner circle. We got to make sure that we respond very quickly to and ensure protecting safety and life. We got to make sure that we can open up our facilities as soon as practicable and when it's safe for the community to restore the access or the services that we provide to our communities. And then we got to reassess the system and rebuild it. Now, if we just stop there and jump back out to the outside circle again, we would not have taken the lessons that we have learned through the emergency management back into the normal process. In order to make sure that we're more resilient moving forward, in order to make sure that we can recover faster, we can ensure that we minimize the times that we have to respond in emergencies, we have to take all the lessons that we learned in each event and take it back out to that outside circle. Make sure we build better, build up. Make sure we minimize these occurrences in the future to the extent practicable. Next slide. So to this end, AASHTO's support for the states through the 2017, 18, and 19 peer exchanges, AASHTO built the center website portal. And in that portal, AASHTO put in information, best practices, forms, and the like to ensure that everyone can start using more information more consistently across all 50 states and 2 territories. We're putting together resilience webinars very soon. We got to get it approved, of course, by FHWA, but we hope to start these resilience webinars by summer of this year. And we expect to have 6 webinars within a 1-year period. If this works out really well, if it's popular and we're getting a lot of information out there and a lot of feedback from the communities, we'll definitely push to include more of them to continue the practice. And the peer exchanges that we're looking at, AASHTO's broken up into 4 regions. We're going to be setting up regional meetings to ensure that we can bring all the regions together, all the stakeholders together in those regions to see how we can operate together better. For Hawaii, we're a little bit separated from everyone else, sadly. So we won't be able to tie in on the emergency management side as much as everybody else. But member states who are bordered together can definitely start sharing practices in emergency management through all events that we have. Next slide, please. So pulling this all together, just for Hawaii, wanted to make sure that we started off moving forward on the right path. Now, for us, we didn't move forward as quickly as we wanted to. In 2003, we put together a shoreline protection report that pretty much told us what areas we need to harden or we need to protect in order to minimize any shutdowns of our roadways or impacts to our communities. Since that time, nothing was done with that report. And because of that, we have about 20% of our roadways in Hawaii impacted by shoreline erosion that required either lane shutdowns or emergency management to respond to them. We also put together in 2007 a rockfall report that prioritized areas that we never really acted on. So now we're paying the price of inaction. Now we're making sure that we got to go out and hit everything. We wanted to make sure that we created policies internally to ensure that this doesn't happen again. We have a state sea level rise report that kicks out a target of 3.2 foot rise throughout the state by the end of the century. All of our policies dictate that we must consider all sea level rise and associated groundwater rise with any developments we do for DOT. We're also making sure that when we evaluate our current policies, we make sure that we're looking at those policies reflecting what we're seeing in front of us. We designed to 100-year floods when necessary, but we're seeing that those 100-year floods are happening every other year or every year. So does it make sense for us to continue to do that or upgrade our policies to look at the 500-year floods instead? We're evaluating all of those to make sure we understand the economic impacts, but also the improvements that we get for the system. We also know that when we start looking at our policies, we got to look at the externals as well. We have roads along our state that runs along our coastlines that service communities that are in those coastline areas. Those roads will be inundated based on our sea level rise assessments by the end of the century. They'll be significantly impacted by the middle of the century, which means if we're going to service that community in that area, we'll have to relocate those roads or elevate them within the next 20 years. But the big questions that we're asking right now is, that roadway is at the same elevation as the homes that are in that area. If that roadway is going to be inundated and unusable by mid-century, what makes me think that the homes will be there? So one of the big questions that we're asking the policymakers to consider is, what land use can we consider is going to be in place when inundation occurs? Because that's going to feed tremendously into the way we service the communities and where we service them as we go forward. That'll help us kind of align our resources to ensure that we're working in the right direction. All that being said, we know that we need to not only address the problems that are coming with the future extreme events becoming more and more extreme, more and more often, we're looking at some of the causes that we're seeing out there as well. So we're greening our construction, we're greening our operations, we're working with our communities to ensure that we can minimize our CO2 footprint to try and help out on the situation in the long run. I can talk about that a little bit more if anybody has questions. for our priorities, we're making sure that we set priorities on the system based on resilience, not just based on congestion or capacity or safety or preservation of the system, but based on resilience as well. We're looking at collaborating with all of our stakeholders to ensure that it's not just a DOT-centric resiliency plan that we're looking towards. We're working with WSP right now to make sure we push forward on a resiliency plan that takes into account all stakeholders of the system. Definitely those that own infrastructure within the highways, but also those that are protecting lands outside of it. Also those that are dictating the land use to the system, and those that are living with the impacts of the system as it goes through. It's not that easy to coordinate with everybody, but if we don't do it now, we're going to come up with a plan that's DOT-centric that others cannot live with. And we're aligning a lot of the state governmental actions. I think everyone will see in their states and in different jurisdictions, a lot of people are moving forward with different resiliency plans at the same time. We're trying to pull them all together through our State Climate Change Commission to ensure that we're having the same conversations and we're unifying a goal. For us, we put together an environmental resource council 4 years ago. And the main reason for that was to ensure that we could move projects a lot more efficiently. We could talk to resource agencies before projects went out and to ensure that we took care of any issues that they would have and projects would move forward very quickly on the environmental permitting. But we're using that committee as the primary stakeholder when we're looking at options to make our system more resilient. So those are the things that we're trying to align. But in general, our communities, our stakeholders really don't care about the policies and the conversations that we're having unless something gets done. So we wanted to make sure that we showed the community that based on the information that we have, we are taking action immediately. So last year we put together a report that reprioritized all the shoreline areas that are under attack by sea level or shore erosion. Within that year, within the time that we completed that report to now, we've completed all the hotspots throughout the state to show the public, we heard you. We know you want us to protect you a lot better. We took care of that. Now we're moving forward on the next step to see which areas we can start either relocating or protecting at low cost with low impact to the environment and to the economy to ensure that the public understands that we're taking the next steps and moving it forward. We know the overall problem for us in the future is it has about a $15 billion price tag. But we know that if we just focus on that larger problem in the future without taking those incremental steps now, we're not going to succeed. So taking those steps, making sure we institutionalize our approach to resiliency and ensuring everyone comes along or the right people come along is the approach that Hawaii is taking. Next slide, please. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Ed. We have a few minutes remaining in our time. So if anyone does have any questions for Ed, for Deb, or Pat, please do feel free to send them in. In the meantime, as people are furiously typing away, Ed, I just ask you to maybe expand on, you mentioned how your agency is looking to reduce the overall carbon footprints.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So for us, we went through an energy savings contract to make sure we converted all of our lights in our system to cut off LED. And that cut 50% of the energy burn throughout our state system. We installed PVs on each of our base yards and buildings to ensure that we minimize the energy burn that we have at our structures as well. And that cut our energy cost by 60%. On the vehicle side, we're pushing heavily to convert the 2,000 vehicles within the state that we have in light duty sedans within 3 to 4 years. In general, in the past, when we tried to do this, our clunky procurement process made it very difficult. But we found a model, actually going to the NGA meetings, that other jurisdictions are using to purchase the service of EVs and the associated charging stations. So we put out the RFP and we came back with 4 bidders. So by June of this year, we'll execute the contract that will allow all state agencies, all county agencies who jumped in as well, and all state and county agencies and University of Hawaii to purchase the service of EVs at a pretty reasonable rate per year and the associated charging stations very quickly. So those 2,000 conversions for electric vehicles, that represents, I think we only have 10,000 electric vehicles in the state. So we would effectively add another 20% to the conversion throughout. But the bigger deal with that is once we start putting the charging systems in throughout the state, and the public in general sees that their range anxiety issues start going away because charging stations are more prevalent and more available, then the hope is it'll start spurring more adoption of EVs publicly.
Thanks for that, Ed. Well, we're coming close to time and seeing no other questions coming in. I'd just like to thank all of you for joining us. I'd like to thank Ed, Deb, and Pat for their presentations and really stress, again, the message of this webinar that the extreme weather events and the longer-term trends that we are seeing both have incremental and severe costs on our transportation systems. And so thinking holistically about resilience and mitigation before, during, and after disasters is critical. We will make this recording available online. We'll be sending it out afterwards to all that have registered, and it will be publicly available if you'd like to share it with anyone. Thank you again, and thank you to all of our presenters.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.